I think part of the thing is if you just look at the cartels themselves, right? We know that those cartels, whether we want to admit it or not, do back certain people for president of Mexico, right? We know that they back certain parties that are willing to take a hands-off approach. Let's just put it that way to them. I think you would agree with that. I think most people would agree with that. And so I think the CIA sees it from that perspective, not the cartel perspective. Who should be in power that will further our interests as a country from a national security perspective? And if it's the Sinaloa backing a president that we think from a national security perspective, right, is going to do what we want them to do, whether that's right or wrong, we are going to back that cartel because they are the ones then backing that.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Welcome to Borderland Narcosis, an Ironclad original. Our next guest is Tracy Walder, who is a former CIA agent and former FBI agent. We talk a lot about her extensive knowledge about the Taliban and how the CIA was involved there, and as well as our connections to the cartel. I think it's a very interesting conversation, something that you guys should hear. Let's check it out. Well, Tracy, first, thank you so much for joining us on Borderland Narcosis. This season, we've kind of came out the gate swinging. We've had some really interesting guests. Several of those individuals spent some time in prison who had connections to the cartel and are now assisting law enforcement officers with a lot of the information that they have. But for me, there's a lot of questions that lead to your background. And for the audience that's listening or watching right now, Tracy has a background with the FBI and CIA. And that was fascinating as first when looking into your bio. And so I want to really dig into that first before we get any further. Please explain how your career has kind of evolved from CIA, FBI, or vice versa. I'm not sure exactly how the system worked for you.
Yeah, I started in CIA first, actually. And I worked there before, during, and after September 11th in the Counterterrorism Center. So obviously that was a interesting time to be there. I was recruited right out of college. So I started at the age of 21. So I was really, really young, obviously. But a lot of my work, I was actually the first person to fly the CIA's drone program ever in the history of the agency. Wow. to work on their armed drones. And so obviously I have thoughts about how they're being used, on the border, because that's been sort of, I guess, a hot topic issue, if you will. But I started at CIA. I worked there. Obviously, I served multiple tours overseas and those kinds of things. And then I'll just be super honest with the audience. I was really tired of being overseas. Obviously, I was there at a very stressful time. I don't know any other way to put that, being there in the Counterterrorism Center on September 11th. I'm sure people can imagine how that was. I'm still really good friends with my former bosses. They were bridesmaids at my wedding. Like, I didn't leave under bad circumstances. I wanted to work the counterterrorism mission, but here in the United States. And so that's when I decided I could still do that, but become an FBI agent, because obviously we work pretty much exclusively domestically, unless it's, like a legal attaché office or something like that. And so I obviously went through Quantico, graduated, all the things, but I was not put working CT. I actually was put working first Chinese counterintelligence, but because I was sent to a really small residential agency, or RA, I worked like everything, because there's just not as many agents, right? And so especially when you're the only woman, if there's women on a drug raid. So we were mostly working with the Mexican Mafia, MS-13, that kind of gang activity, the triads with Asian gangs. It just depended. But a lot of times they have to bring a woman with them, right, on arrests. And so I worked that. I worked white collar crime, all those kinds of things. And now I'm the national security contributor to News Nation, which is, I love working for them. And then I also am an adjunct faculty of criminal justice at Texas Christian University.
Wow. That's a very impressive resume.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Did you initially want to become a CIA agent, or was it just coincidentally the degree that you picked, the college you picked aligned and they kind of recruited you?
None of the above. I'm so sorry. None of the above is actually the answer to that question. And I like sharing the story with people because obviously now I work with college students, right? You know, when I teach. And I feel like sometimes people feel like there's this formula or boxes that they need to check to like get into these careers. And I am living proof that none of that applies. So I guess to orient the audience, I grew up in a pre 9/11 world. So I grew up like CT was not the issue of the day. Al Qaeda wasn't even born until 1989, right? Like I didn't know that that's what you wanted to do. Also, we didn't have like, everyone has pop culture, like Homeland, Criminal Minds, you know, all the shows. I didn't have any of that growing up. We had a show called Chips. Like that was it. I don't know if anyone remembers that show, but I loved that show. And like, that was it. I had no exposure. Like, why would I want a career there? Because I didn't even know that you could have a career there, if that makes any sense. And so my life changed though. I was in college, it was 1997. And I was working out, was watching the news, and this dude was in a cave with 2 machine guns next to him being interviewed. And it was there that he issued his declaration of war against the US. And that was Osama bin Laden. It was the only interview he ever did with the West, ever. And so I was like, who is this guy? But the problem is I went to college at the same school. My dad was a professor, so I wanted the free tuition, obviously. And I'm like, what can I do to learn more about this counterterrorism thing, but still graduate with my history degree in 4 years? Because I was going to be a high school history teacher. And so I started taking like international relations courses, Middle Eastern history courses. But again, didn't know that that was like a job you could have. And I went to a career fair. This would have been 1999, I think, by this point. And I had brought my resume with me because I was actually applying for an internship in DC. And I saw a table and it said CIA, and they were looking for liberal arts majors, which I was history. And I said, hey, do you work this counterterrorism thing? And they're like, nah, not really. Well, our focus right now is on Russia, because Russia's always kind of Russia, and actually South America, Central and South America, just because there were a lot of coups d'etats going on. This was like the height of the FARC in Colombia, and they were really looking for Spanish speakers and Russian speakers. I don't speak any foreign languages, but I just said, here's my resume, and they called. It's that silly of a story.
Wow. It's crazy. So obviously we talk a lot about the cartel. We talk about drugs, and we've had every kind of, I guess, guest on here that has an expertise. Something that we've seen recently in the news that kind of really been highlighted through the Ukraine kind of Russian conflict was the drone warfare. Mm-hmm. I know that's a space of your expertise, so I definitely want to start there. We're going to get off that conversation eventually, but let's start there. I'll tell you from my experience, drones have been very successful for us when I was in the military, right? So I served with 2nd 75th Ranger Regiment, tours out there. We use Predators for a lot of different things. Moving forward in the Border Patrol, it was really early on, the special operations of the Border Patrol, we started using drones as well for more surveillance, right? For trying to identify bodies crossing, drug loads, blah, blah, blah. Now, during the time they've been weaponized through our military, but you're starting to see other countries using it. Ukraine and Russia use it in a way that I've never imagined would be. I should have thought it. I just didn't. And then when you start to see it, and then now just this morning, I got another video from some drone warfare. I think Ed Cadron just posted it. It is happening way more often than we expected. Their skill sets and levels of using these have become very professional. And I'd love to hear kind of first your initial thoughts when you first saw that and it was like, oh, here we go.
Well, first of all, thank you for your service. I just want to say that. And I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier. But I think with drones, obviously they have evolved significantly since I started with the first armed drones, right? With the Hellfires. I think biggest issue, because I think people see the word drone, right? And they assume that it's the Pakistan model, right? Like we're going in there with the Hellfires, with it armed. And that's actually not what's going on. You're so right. Russia and Ukraine are almost using them in the sky against each other, which is like It's like nothing I have personally seen. I agree with you. I think in terms of how they are being used right now, their chemical sniffing capabilities are so much more advanced than they ever were. And I think that is actually incredibly impressive. When we were flying them over Afghanistan, we were helping the DEA a little bit, over the poppy fields and the opiate, because obviously that's one of their largest exports. But there really wasn't much we could do from a chemical perspective, right? To see where all of this was being refined. There just wasn't. This was obviously in the early 2000s. But now to see that it's so much more than just a heat signature or picking up signals and those kinds of things, that they have the ability. They are not detecting these chemicals through temperature changes, which is what they originally were doing. That's not what they're doing. And I think it's really impressive. Also, the fact that they're obviously unarmed at this point in time, it's good.
Can I stop you real quick? Did you say that they're identifying chemicals through the drones?
That's how they were able to identify some of, not all, but obviously some of the fentanyl labs, is by the chemical signature that they were emitting, not just from thermal, because I'm sure some of these labs, right, are obviously in very much highly foliaged places, and that makes thermal very difficult to detect, right? I mean, I'm guessing you can, depending on the thickness, right, of the foliage, but that's why they were so great in Afghanistan, because there's no foliage and we could just see the temperature changes. But as you know, that's not the case, right? In South America, Central America, it's obviously heavily foliaged. And so the fact that they are able to, through chemical signatures. But what I have noticed is in all the reporting about that, they're not giving away the way that they're doing that. And so I think that is something that's going to kind of remain tightly held for a while.
So I'm going to stop you again, because I don't know if I zoned out or missed it, but who's using that capability? Is that us or is that the cartel?
That's us.
And why are they using it? That's what we're using right now. Yeah. So we're currently using drones, the ones that are going around right now in Mexico, the ones that we've
Reapers is the ones that I'm talking about. So not.
Whoa.
Oh, sorry.
I missed that. So it's so funny because I'm thinking about how
cartels. I don't.
So you're talking about the CIA use of the drones that we've heard on the news.
Correct.
That's what's happening currently right now. Those routes that they're taking,
correct,
they're using those routes to do a strategic kind of intel pull, and somehow they're using it by gathering the chemical scent.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, because I'm sure with drones, it's not always 100%, right? You don't always get a chemical signature, a heat signature, a signal, like you don't always get that, right? But in my opinion, it's just an added tool in the drone repertoire that I think is a good thing, for lack of a better word. And I think that's
fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's where I kind of got lost. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I should have been more clear.
No, it's not you. It's not you. It's me. It's okay. Yeah. So, interesting. So now that I'm on the same page with you, now that the
I apologize. That's on me. And I'm sorry.
No. Sometimes I zone out, and I thought I might have just gone for a minute, but I'm here. I'm back. Squirrel.
Okay. Welcome back.
So the CIA is using. You said what kind of drones are they currently using?
The MQ-9s, the Reapers.
The Reapers.
That's what's been reported. I don't want to say they're not using any other kind of drone because we don't know, but that's what's been widely at least reported right now. And I'm not surprised that that's what they're using. That's probably the newest.
Those are flown by just one individual?
I can't go into details about that. I'm super sorry.
Nope, you're perfectly fine. I'm going to ask questions I don't even know. I'm sorry.
I don't want you to think that I am being purposely like this. I just don't obviously want to get in trouble for divulging.
And I'll tell you something. I come from the special operations background, and my mind is still there. And I never want to give away any kind of intel that might hurt or affect our operations. And so I completely understand where you're coming from with that. It makes it hard for me to ask some of these questions. Let's see.
I say and let's see how it goes. It can't hurt.
No worries. So as we gathered the intel recently, there was just recently, President Scheinbaum, sorry, where is it? I have a question in here that I was going to ask you, and I'm wondering if it probably ties to it. I'm so sorry. I kind of got thrown for a loop for there. All right, here we go. President Claudia Scheinbaum was able to extradite 29 cartel operatives to the U.S. Now, I'm curious. That's an interesting topic because she made that choice to do so. And I'm curious if the intel that they're able to gather from this, was that any significance to feel of a threat to the Mexican side of the country? Is it now kind of pushing them to make decisions like that?
I personally believe so, but I actually think some of that too, this is just in my opinion. Obviously at CIA, I used FISA a lot, and particularly Section 702. And I know Representative Crenshaw, I live in Texas, and had put forth, right, labeling cartels as terrorist organizations. And we do have reporting that those 702 warrants actually have yielded pretty significant batches of intelligence in terms of where some of the raw chemicals are coming from, and where some of the labs are located. And then that obviously helps drive those Reaper routes that we were talking about, right? There's just not a free for all in terms of how they're flying over Mexico. And obviously they are doing these Reaper routes in conjunction with Scheinbaum and with Mexico, right? We've been invited in to do that. And so in my opinion, I think it's a combination of both, to be totally honest with you, what we've gleaned from those FISA warrants, and then also what we have been able to glean from the Reaper missions.
Why? I'm going to ask it and just shut me down if anything, but why are we now authorized to do this? Is it just because of the designation of the cartel now, or we just never thought to do it?
I think that's another sort of misunderstanding. It's obviously being reported now, right? A lot, but we've been doing it for actually quite a while. Since the earliest reporting I've seen is 2019. I suspect, if you want me to be super honest with you, it goes back further than that. We just don't want to discuss it, right? Again, I don't know. I have nothing to prove that. I'm just going off based of what I did in intelligence. But the earliest reporting from legitimate news sources that I've seen is that we actually have been doing this in conjunction with Mexico since 2019. But as you mentioned, the terrorist designation is new.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, is there other forms of intelligence gathering outside of drones that you know are probably public information?
I think what's difficult with Mexico, and I think it's actually very similar. I remember being at CIA and talking with the folks in the Counter Narcotics Center, just because we were following some routes from their since defunct, but Sendero Luminoso was working with Hezbollah in the tri-border region. And so obviously we were following Hezbollah, but they said that narcotics networks are just as difficult to penetrate from a human intelligence perspective as terrorist networks. Because, you know, in Afghanistan, where I operated a lot, everything is familial, everything is clannish. And so when you bring in this outsider to try to get human intelligence, it's virtually impossible. And I think the same rings true for the cartels and for those networks. And so human intelligence, in my opinion, in terms of the war on drugs, right, and the war on the cartels is, I don't want to say impossible, but incredibly difficult to penetrate. So relying on these other forms, signals intelligence, and basically imagery intelligence, because that's what drones are giving us, is actually golden, quite frankly.
Yeah. You know, when I saw in the news that they were using drones, you know, the next interview I had was with another individual who's very familiar with kind of the cartel operations in Mexico. And he said a lot of the communications, the normal means of communications has ceased, and they started doing other means of communication. They were all under the impression that those flights were kind of gathering intel via cell phone data, text messaging, and now hearing that part of it, and I'm sure there could be multi different uses, but part of that was trying to identify, you know, fentanyl and slow down, I guess, the process of that. And now that, you know, this is coming to light, is there is there any kind of way that they're going to try and counter this? I'm sure there is. And I just ask, like, because I'm trying to further understand this. But for us to be able to use scent, and just from my own experience, we used to use heat signatures to identify, dope, drugs, and stuff like that. But now that the CIA is using scent, I imagine there's going to be a counter to this.
100%. And that's why drones, their capability have evolved, right? Because as you mentioned before, the previous guest talked about their signals collection capabilities, right? That's not a secret. And they know now, I wouldn't say all of them know, but a lot of them know because they share that information with each other throughout cartels, how to circumvent that, right? Same thing with heat signatures. They know we have the capability to do that. So there's a way to sort of circumvent that. Not foolproof, but there's a way to do that. There's no question now, right? That they will 100% find a way to circumvent that. Now, I suspect it's going to be more difficult because how are you going to stop manufacturing the fentanyl, right? Like, how's that going to work out? Where are they going to have to find a whole new method? That just seems cumbersome, right? Whereas to evade signals detection and heat detection is a little less cumbersome and a little less complicated. So I think it's going to take them a while, in my opinion, to figure that out, unless they have access to something I don't know about.
Yeah. Off this subject onto just the CIA in general, there's a lot of talk about how the CIA has, I would say, used some cartel members as assets. Mm-hmm. In your experience, is this something that is common practice?
I'm trying to figure out a way to answer that right without going into like sources and methods and protect them.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to make deals with people that are unsavory characters for the betterment of our national security, or in this case, the war on drugs, right? And so I think, yes, because to my point earlier, what I discussed about penetrating some of these networks, particularly cartels, terrorist groups, those kinds of things, sometimes your best way in is through one of them. And that may not seem like a savory thing to do. It may seem uncomfortable. Sometimes it's the only way that we can get actionable human intelligence.
I mean, it's so this audience always attacks anyone who's CIA on the show.
Great. Because so excited.
You're welcome. No, but you know what it is people dig into the history, right? The history of this CIA's involvement, the destabilization. 100%. What everyone leads to is like, the CIA started this or that. And, some's been confirmed, some hasn't been confirmed, and it's an interesting thing. I have here in my notes is that they accuse the prioritizing geopolitical interests over stopping the drug trade, and things like that, in the sense of sometimes, like you said, is the CIA has to make a deal with someone who's probably unsavory for the betterment of the mission, that bigger picture. What's the bigger picture right now with Mexico? What's the bigger picture? I know at one point, some intel states that we were assisting one cartel to take out a worse cartel. It's like, choosing your enemy kind of idea. But what would be the goal right now when it comes to Mexico?
Well, and just to kind of back up, like, for your audience, I actually understand where they're coming from about what they're saying about CIA. I am not personally going to sit here and defend every single thing that they have done, because they have absolutely done things and destabilized regimes that, in my opinion, we should have never been involved in. And I think we have to recognize that. I'm not a naive person in any way, shape, or form. And so I want to acknowledge that and actually say that I agree to a certain point with individuals. So I'm not a CIA officer who's going to sit here and not take any criticism, right, of the CIA, because we absolutely, in my opinion, have done things that are wrong. But I think in terms of Mexico, obviously, I think our big picture is two things, right? Obviously, stemming the flow of fentanyl into the United States. I think that's probably issue number one. But I think issue number two, at least what it seems like from the current administration, right, is stemming the flow of immigration coming into the U.S. So I think that's probably the bigger picture, but I don't know for sure. Why
is immigration even a thought to the CIA? Is it is it because of the potential of, terrorist organizations such as the ones that you fought in Afghanistan or that you tried to, destabilize, potentially using that access?
In my opinion, that's what I believe. That's why the CIA would be interested in that, as well as the FBI, right? I think we do know this is not surprising in any way, shape, or form, particularly Hezbollah. This back in the day when I was working there, they were 100% using the routes that cartels had established to try to gain entry into the US. We were able to stop that, but they were doing that because I think for them, they're like, well, why would we make another route to get in? If we have these routes that we can use, we simply pay them to use them. They're pretty flush with cash from Iran. And so they are able to gain entry into the United States. I think they're not as concerned, obviously, about immigrants themselves, right, coming over. I think they are much more concerned about people on terror watch lists coming through that southern border.
Is that why the CIA's interest in this is in using their drones, you believe, is just in the best interest of the nation? But it's just confusing me because we have so many agencies, right? We have the DEA, we have the Homeland Security, we have FBI. Why is the CIA involved in this matter now?
Again, I think they have been, at least for probably 7 years or so. I think that has been the way. I believe, and again, I'm trying to not divulge too much. I think a lot of it has to do with their drone capabilities. That's what I think. I think they are different than the capabilities of other organizations here in the US. So obviously I was an FBI agent too. The FBI really is not utilizing drones as much, right, as I think we would think. And so I think the CIA, in my opinion, has far more experience than some of these other organizations. And that's why they're involved, because Mexico has gotten on board with it. I mean, again, they know we're operating there, right? This is not a Pakistan situation where it's covert and all of that. That's not going on. And so I think Mexico knows. Mexico is aware that it's the CIA probably flying them. And so I don't think it's surprising or shocking per se, but I just think it has to do with their capabilities in regards to drones.
Ironclad creates premium content no matter the environment. From extreme elements to unforgiving terrain, we thrive on crafting content that captures the essence of your brand in the most challenging conditions. Bring your brand story to life, ensuring your message leaves an impact. Ready to elevate your vision? Connect with us today at ironcladagency.com.
In the past, or even if you just know, but based on your experience, I'm trying to word everything appropriate as well.
It doesn't have to be. Well, you can do or say whatever you want. I'm not offended.
Well, I want to be respectful in how this interview is conducted as well,
But I don't mind. You please don't feel like you have to hold anything back. I really am never bothered by it.
Okay. You're gonna block me on social media after this one. No, just
like that's not the thing. I think we have to be able to engage in dialogue, whether we agree or not, like about these topics without becoming like crazy offended, right? Like I don't have a problem with it.
Notes aside, right? There's all these questions. I feel like I know the answers to them, but what really, just through the years of going over this subject with cartel, with America and money, right? There's corruption obviously involved in here somewhere, but a lot of the conversation in drugs always stems back to the CIA, whether the CIA's involvement with the cocaine, whether it was CIA's involvement with destabilizing certain countries. And currently right now you have just talk about the two major cartels, right? CJ&G and the Sinaloa cartel. Those are two big ones that stick out to me right now. And there's a lot of say that the CIA is involved with helping the Sinaloa cartel take over during certain times when other cartels were a little bit less manageable, almost like the better enemy. And then now just recently, the capture of El Mayo, very interesting stuff. But right away, El Mayo has ties to California, which is essentially several informers that we have internally told us about the connections to the CIA. And so I just keep hearing the CIA in every part of this conversation. And I just don't understand what was the big picture of it. And is it is it CIA being corrupted, or do they really see a big picture in like fostering the power of the cartel and the money in that corruption? I don't understand it really. And I know there's not really a question there other than why is the CIA in all of these conversations I have with every single person that comes in here, from law enforcement to former cartel guys who spent 20 years in prison?
Again, that's not an offensive question, just so you know. Like, I'm not like personally offended. First of all, I can't obviously speak to it in depth because I did not work cartels, right? I did not work counter narcotics at the CIA. So I want to be clear about that. But what I can speak about is just from like a broad sense, right? In terms of what they do. I do think there is a pervasive ideology that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Right. So like starting at the very base level of that, I do think that that's where some of that comes from. Now, let's just take the Sinaloa cartel, for example, just because I agree with you. It is probably one of the largest ones right now. I think part of the thing is if you just look at the cartels themselves, right? We know that those cartels, whether we want to admit it or not, do back certain people for president of Mexico, right? We know that they back certain parties that are willing to take a hands-off approach. Let's just put it that way to them. I think you would agree with that. I think most people would agree with that. And so I think the CIA sees it from that perspective, not the cartel perspective. Who should be in power that will further our interests as a country from a national security perspective? And if it's the Sinaloa backing a president that we think from a national security perspective, right, is going to do what we want them to do, whether that's right or wrong, we are going to back that cartel because they are the ones then backing that government party. I think that's where it's coming from, because that's what we saw a lot of in Colombia, quite frankly, obviously with the FARC and Uribe and all of that. When the CIA was involved in that, right? There's no question. But they were backing those that they felt would further our political goals. It's actually more about politics, in my opinion. It is about like the cartels themselves. Now, is there a serious moral problem with backing like probably the largest cartel, most violent cartel, right? In Mexico, 1,000,000%, because we're backing them with American money, right? And American support. And that's, for lack of a better word, gross, right? Like that's hugely problematic. But it's no different. And I'm not saying this is right, but it's no different than if we look at Afghanistan, right? Where we know opium is the largest export out of Afghanistan. And the Taliban is operating very much like a cartel in terms of how they are dealing with that. We backed that in the 80s, right? Because that to us was better than communism, was better than Russia. That is how we are looking at it. Now, it doesn't feel good to say that, right? But I think we have to acknowledge that. And so for us, because we didn't want Afghanistan to fall to the Soviets, or fall to that communist ideology, even though the Taliban were war and drug lords, I mean, that's what they were doing, right? We still backed them. Obviously, that backfired on us 20 years later. We know that. But that's the same thing, in my opinion, that is going on with the cartels in Mexico. It's less about like the drugs and the cartels themselves and more about the politics that they support. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's gonna lead me to the next thing is, the last 4 years we had an administration who kind of was hands off as well on our end. And, we could say that I don't want to make this a politically left, right, anything other than it was a very open border, which is very dangerous for our own country. And we all kind of know that, right?
Totally agree.
What do you think? And this is more just of a question of your experience. And again, is, now we have an administration that is shutting down the border, right? And so to me, it feels like the right choice, but then this ripple effect goes downward into the cartel side of things. And I'm curious to see what happens there. But then it starts to raise the question, like, was there some kind of agreement plan? And I don't want to be conspiracy by any means, but it just feels very odd that the cartels have been able to kind of run wild however they wanted to, and now they can't. I think we're going to run into some backlash to that at some point, which is okay. But for 4 years, we just allowed it to flow. And it almost feels like, does that mean there was some kind of partnership in the sense? That's very crazy question, but I'm very curious to know what you think, in the sense of like, we went from almost no rules to now we definitely have, repercussions for their actions.
I just want to be sure I understand what you're asking. So
Yeah.
what you're saying is that we went through basically 4 years of no border rules, right? Like in terms of who's coming in and out. And so do we feel like that was a deal that was struck with the previous administration? Is that kind of what I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, because for someone like me who's lived both the lives of like the security of it, the law enforcement of it, all of it, I didn't get too emotionally invested in, other than the fact that I kept saying like, what do you gain from this? Like, what does the administration gain from this? What does the country gain from this? And I found nothing that was of value. It found more fear. Like, this is scary, right? And so then I'm like, well, if none of us gain from it, the higher ups, do they gain from it? Is there someone in this decision making train gain value, whether financially or corruption? I don't know, but that's I couldn't come up with an idea. So then it felt like there's something odd to me about that. And I don't think that's a CIA thing. I think it's above that. I think there's something weird about not putting up some boundaries that directly help and assist almost the cartel in action.
I actually totally agree with what you're saying. And I think it's not conspiratorial in nature. It's human in nature, right? Like, why would we engage in diplomacy with another country if we weren't going to get something out of it, right? Like, isn't that the whole point? Like, that is the whole point. And I do agree with you, again, not absolving the CIA, but I do think it's way bigger than that. No offense to the CIA. I do think immigration and border policy it is political, right? Because different politicians make different rules and deals depending on what they do and don't support. I actually fully agree that the past 4 years under the previous administration, how we treated the border was unacceptable, like full stop. Full stop. And it was sort of this like open field day, right? On people and terrorist drugs, whatever, coming through. And that is hugely problematic. I think that what we probably got out of it had to most likely do with goods, services, and lowered tariffs and taxes on our goods as a result of that, because I think money talks, right? And so I think from our perspective, again, I don't know. I obviously didn't work in the Biden administration. I have no idea how they would have benefited from that. But that to me is where it always goes back to is, did they then in turn make financial policies that we, the US, benefited from as a result of that? But then I think as like a responsible leader, you need to take a step back and be like, okay, maybe we need to meet in the middle here so that it's not this like free for all. Because I think we had veered too far over. I personally think it was financial, what we were getting out of them. This sounds like callous to say, but I'll just be honest. We don't necessarily need intelligence from the Mexicans regarding, terrorism, national security, all of those things. They're not a country that we typically rely on. There are other Latin American countries that are actually better at it that we rely on. So I don't think it was to get, this free access of information. If it was Saudi Arabia, yeah, perhaps, but it's not. And so I think it had to do with stuff and money. That's what I think.
Yeah, it was. I just couldn't put my finger on it. And normally, like, I feel like I'm a very level thinker on this whole subject, and I kept thinking, like, I don't understand what the purpose is of this. I don't see it. It didn't make sense, and so it's just confusing. So now, moving forward, we have this very strict, border policy, which I think is important. We have some leaders in certain places that are very strict on this subject. We're going after the cartel. What are your thoughts on the potential? And again, I know this is now just pure opinion, right? Okay. But someone who is, look, you're in the space of the government for so many years. I think you kind of have a pulse on what the thought process might be. But what are your thoughts on us having potentially our special operations going into the country and potentially helping dismantle the cartel? You've done this in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know what that looks like. I've done it firsthand as well. I know what that looks like. What are your thoughts on that going into Mexico? Is it do you believe it's a good decision or bad decision? Okay, that's tough. So I get asked that almost every single weekend on News Nation when I'm on air for them. Yeah. Sorry.
No, you're fine. And I actually was on with, I don't know if you guys know General Wesley Clark. I was on with him. And I think he and I actually like both, I don't know, completely agreed, but like somewhat agreed that if we ever go in, if we do, it needs to be special ops, right? Like it cannot be, or CIA Special Activities Division. We are not going in there, full army troops. That's not what's happening. But we have to be very, very careful, because then the question is what if, right? Because like, let's look at Pakistan, for example, Abbottabad, where we got bin Laden. I don't think people realize, but like, had we not caught him, it would have been an act of war. We invaded another country covertly, right? But we caught bin Laden. So we technically, I don't know how crass I can be, but we caught Pakistan with their pants down, right? And so they really had no other choice but to be like, it's okay. It's fine. We won't strike back. Yeah, we're sorry, right? Like that's what happened there. I think we have to have that same motivation with Mexico, which I know sounds terrible, but there has to be that, or we have to get their government's buy-in to do it, which I don't think is going to happen. Sheinbaum has said multiple times that she would not allow it. I don't know if she's going to change her mind. But if we go in without her buy-in at all, right? If we go in special forces, the SEALs, whomever we're going to use to do that combination, there has to be like this gotcha, almost like we got with bin Laden, because that was our bargaining chip to Pakistan and really the rest of the Arab nations, that this was not an act of war. Like, you harbored bin Laden. Like, what are you going to say about that? So I think that's how that has to look in Mexico. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I've had several guests that believe that there has been in the past, 5 years, several covert operations that has already happened in Mexico. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I would agree to that. I think that they've probably been done well, or to be honest with you, we don't know how much the Mexican government was okay with it, right? A lot of times what will happen, and that we saw this in the war on terror so many times, is countries would say, yeah, you can come in and get this person, but we don't want to know about it. And we are going to say it never happened. Right. And so that's very normal, right? Because other countries don't want to be like, yeah, we let the US come in and like kidnap a terrorist off of the streets. It doesn't look good. It's not a good look. But I would think that something like that absolutely has happened in Mexico. And I think based on my experience, the government was probably okay with it.
Yeah, in hearing that, President Claudia Sheinbaum might not support us going in makes me feel that there's some kind of tie to the cartel, which we know most likely when you get that high in political position in Mexico, there is a involvement of some kind of like thumbs up by the cartel. And so I think that's the big fear that I think you're having there, which becomes a very slippery slope for her in the sense of like, how much will she allow? And at some point, is the cartel going to be upset that we're even allowed to fly drones? You know what I'm saying? Is that going to affect her presidency? Crazy times. So go ahead, please.
No, I don't think the drone flights will affect her presidency. I think covert ops will, in my opinion.
We had another guest in here, and I'd love to hear your opinion on what you think if his statement is close to true or not. It became a big discussion, but one of the individuals who worked close with the Sinaloa cartel, one of the individuals who worked close with the Sinaloa cartel and spent 20 years in prison said that it is known without the higher echelons of the drug cartels that the CJNG has hired former special operations individuals to help train them and actually currently kind of help run their organization. Through your time in CIA or FBI, is this kind of a common knowledge thing, or is it just kind of a rumor that has not been able to be proven yet, or any knowledge of this at all?
No, I'm just trying to figure out how. Sorry.
The long pause says a lot.
No, listen. Because part of me gets really mad at people like that, if to be completely honest with you. Like, what are you doing? You're just selling out for money, because they're probably paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, for these individuals to do that. And these are probably retired folks or folks that left, in good standing that are now engaging in this. And so in my opinion, you are just as, not you, but really those that engage in this are just as much responsible, right, for the problems as the cartels themselves. So I'm actually trying to not be like overly mad when I hear about people doing that. In my opinion, and again, I'm not trying to be like Pollyanna, CIA is not perfect. That's not something I ran into when I was there. Again, our military, the British military, multiple other special operations units in different countries work to train other countries, right? But not their terrorist groups and their cartels. So that's what I heard the more of, right? But not training cartels. It's not to say it wouldn't happen. You have these unpatriotic people, in my opinion, that are engaging in that behavior for simply money. Yeah.
I mean, in the amount of money they would pay them, I imagine, is way more than what.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
The other thing is, we have to acknowledge that we're the ones who trained Los Zetas original,
yes.
right? Café, we're the ones who trained them in efforts to hopefully counter this drug epidemic that was happening and turn around. It kind of bit us in the butt. And you know what? Now we're training some again, which is very interesting. What do you think about that personally?
I mean, again, and I hate to keep relating it to this, but I just wish more people would, because it's the same. It's the Taliban, like all over again. We're literally doing the exact same thing now, like that we did in the 80s, right? Like that's what happened. And so I don't know why we don't learn from those lessons. It's incredibly frustrating that we keep doing the same thing over and over. And like, it doesn't work. It's not successful. So I'm not sure why we're repeating it again. But again, we trained the Taliban, right, in the 80s. Then we fought the war on terror to put them down. And guess who's back again, right?
Why do you think we made that decision to start training them again?
The Taliban, so what we were doing with the Taliban in Afghanistan was we weren't necessarily training the Taliban again. We were training those that were kind of pro-democratic groups, right? But obviously we all know that didn't go well, and the Taliban took back over. So now they have all of our stuff, all of our weapons, all of our tactics that we just sort of like left there, right? And so the same thing, in my opinion, is going to happen in Mexico. I don't know why we keep repeating like this policy of doing that, but no one cares what I think, I'm sure.
You have the platform today. You have the platform today. Say what you want. It's interesting to me how it's not the cartel's involvement with all kinds of different things. We know that they're involved in avocados, some kind of legitimate / non-legitimate like efforts of making money, but as well as marijuana. We've heard some that is part of methamphetamines, and then as well as now fentanyl. Fentanyl became the thing. We're focusing on fentanyl, and is it me, or are we just using fentanyl as something that's going to calm everyone down? And then once we shut down the fentanyl, business as usual, we let them continue just to do their thing? Because that's what it feels like from my position. It feels like we're using it almost like as a political gesture and not so much legitimately wanting to go in and dismantle. Because I feel like we could completely dismantle the cartel if we needed to in a few weeks if we really went gung-ho blazing. But it feels more like this is a political tip of the cap. We said we were going to do it. We did it. Now let's move on.
I hope we don't move on. Because if you want me to be totally honest with you, so again, people don't seem to care when I talk about this, but if we really wanted to go after fentanyl, like if we were really serious about it, because that's why I don't think we're serious about it, but if we were really serious about it, we'd go after China. That's where the raw chemicals are coming from, not Mexico. It's being manufactured in Mexico, but we're not going after China. So if the administration was serious, right, about fentanyl, if they were, they need to be going after the raw materials. And those raw materials all come from China. The Coast Guard has intercepted them, right, coming into. So I don't think we are serious. If you want me to be totally honest with you, I do think you're right. This is probably a political issue. But I don't know that it's ever going to be solved, right? Because again, if we don't go after the raw materials, literally, what is the point? China will just find another place to make it. So sorry if I sound so like pessimistic, but like, let's be blunt, like the raw materials are coming from there. We're doing nothing about it. The Coast Guard has intercepted them. It's going to Mexico for finishing, right, and distribution. But like, we're just harping on Mexico. That's what I don't understand.
Yeah, no, that's kind of like that's exactly kind of what I was saying is like we're now focusing on the fentanyl. There's been a drug war for many years. There's been cartel corruption for many years, right? Like we could have so many things we could have done to slow it down, stop it, and we haven't. Now that we have them identified as terrorist organization, like, well, let's go get it. And then it's like, wait, there's so much more we can do because you're right. The China, you know, the all the chemicals that they're getting from China, that's got to be addressed at some point. But as well as once I just don't understand. I personally, just like I said, it feels like more of a political flex. Okay, sounds good. I'm curious to see once we've kind of got a control of fentanyl, what happens next. I hope it's just not swept under the rug and forgotten about, and then we go on to something else that catches our eye. That's my fear.
And I fear that we might, if you want me to be totally honest with you, because I, in my opinion, don't think that we're serious. Because again, if we were, we would be sanctioning China, and we're not.
Does our government make money off the drug trade?
Part of me wonders. I don't know. Obviously, that's my honest answer to that question. I don't know. But obviously money talks, right? I don't know. Part of me wonders, again, if it comes out in diplomacy, right? So remember how we said maybe the CIA was involved, was probably bigger than them in terms of what the end game was. Part of me wonders if the administration knows full well, of course they do, right? Like what China's doing in terms of the raw materials, but maybe in exchange for a more positive trading relationship or a more positive tariff situation that they are choosing to sort of let them off the hook. And that's probably incredibly frustrating to people that are working to stem the flow of drugs, because I do think it is bigger than that, like you mentioned before.
Thank you for listening to Borderland Narcosis, an Ironclad original. Please don't forget to share it with your friends. Let them know. If you guys have any questions or any guests you're interested in us having on, please let me know.